Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for joining us on this Saturday afternoon in real life, a lovely family reunion. And of course, digitally for this gathering to launch an online exhibition titled An Anecdoted Archive of Exhibition Lives, curated by Irit, Rogoff and Nora Sternfeld for Freethought Collective. Nora and Irit are here with us, welcome, and they are joined by our wonderful guests, curator and researcher Lynhan Balatbat-Helbock, who is here as well, and joining us online artist Larry Achiampong. Now, today the conversation, which I hope to take a form of lively exchange, this conversation will center on the notion of the unarchivable, something that resonates powerfully throughout an anecdoted archive of exhibition lives, as that which remains hidden, invisible, not quite graspable, inaudible and illegible perhaps, spectral, if you will, yet what allows those rare, truly meaningful exhibitions make the difference. To make the difference, at least how I understand it, by making felt the possibility of being in and with the world together otherwise. Something in excess of the sum of exhibited works, in excess of ideas and themes the exhibitions elaborate on, in excess of being mere art historical extracts and priorities of art history yet to be written, yet something that is nonetheless present in some exhibitions, something felt in and with the exhibitions that has capacity to make a difference to the thinking, working, and living practices of those who have encountered them. Now, among the many contributors to the project are artists such as Kader Attia, whom we have been collaborating here at BAC in the context of an extraordinary project, Fragments of Repair, and Bruno Zhu, who I believe, yes, he's here with us today, or curators Bonaventure Nigung, Emily Pettig, Yvette Churlin, Doreen Meinde, and many other culture workers, amongst whom many collaborators of BAC. Now, an anecdoted archive of exhibition lives asks its contributors to tell stories about significant personal moments with exhibitions. What they thought they saw, what they felt, what distant worlds were hinted at, and what meaningful things were revealed about their immediate environment. As an archive, in the words of its curators, and I quote, it performs a counter-cartography of the art world, pointing out that significant experiences are enabled not by great international reputations or canonized and spectacular curation, but rather by the exhibition's ability to affect people's lives and change perceptions. An anecdoted archive of exhibition lives was first presented as a physical exhibition at Bergen Assembly in the Norwegian city of Bergen in 2016 in the context of an extraordinary, inspiring project that Freethought curated on the notion of infrastructure. And as I'm mentioning again, the Freethought Collective, besides writer, theorist, teacher and curator Irit Rogoff, and art mediator and curator Nora Sternfeld, Freethought consists further of writer and curator Adrian Heathfield, activist and scholar Stefano Harni, writer, filmmaker and anthropologist Mao Malona, and urbanist and theorist Luis Moreno. And Luis is here with us as well in person. Welcome, Luis. Now, the digital rendering of an anecdoted archive of exhibition lives that we inaugurate today marks a shift, at least as I see it, in the research by Freethought from infrastructure to spectral infrastructure, which is the focus actually of a long-term research trajectory by Freethought here at BAC. A research trajectory that not only entwines with the BAC Fellowship program for situated practice, but which will intermittently surface into public programs at BAC, like this gathering, in the course of the next 2 years. And indeed, while infrastructure is conventionally understood as the operative substrate of contemporary global life and invokes systems such as physical networks for transportation and communications, the organization of waste and utilities, resource flows, digital management and capital movements, the spectral infrastructure grows from previous research by Freethought towards the ghostly, affective and fugitive intensities that undergird both infrastructure and quotidian life. Spectral infrastructure alludes to what freethought calls, and I quote again, the hidden and invisible textures that sustain an undefinable and disruptive quality in an otherwise efficient seeming organism, unquote, or in other cases, quote again, the ephemeral glue that holds things together in affective modality, unquote. Now, spectral infrastructure by nature escapes stable definitions and act as fleeting recompositions and hauntings of dominant historical and present narratives and structures. By so doing, they allow for the warding off of the regimes of capture deployed by contemporary governmentality and governance. The research thus conjures the invisible, inaudible, and illegible through textures, rhythms, atmospheres, invocations, gestures, vernaculars, and affects, elements that escape traditional forms of tracking or measurement, calling instead for experimental forms of mapping, sensing, and tracing. Preliminary fields of inquiry for this research include spectral labor, the chronopolitics of fugitivity and endurance, sediments and residues of social urban radicality, and the realm of the unarchivable. In this framework, you could see this exhibition on Exhibition Lives and this gathering today, in fact, to inaugurate the research strand on the unarchivable, led by Irit and Nora, within the spectral infrastructure trajectory. I'm beyond excited to see this research unfolding today and beyond. Before I offer the floor to our esteemed guests, I'd like to acknowledge all my colleagues at BAC for their remarkable work on today's event and all work at the BAC, for which my sincere thanks and appreciation. For making today's session possible, I want to specifically acknowledge my colleague Julia Morandera, who I would like to also introduce a co-host of today's session, specifically the panel discussion in the second half of this session, as well as Thomas Orbon, who's a program coordinator at BAC, head of public practice Hide van Groningen, and our colleagues Irene Kalabuch-Miron, Ine Rambonet, and the technical team today, Tim van den Hof, Jasper Verburg, and Sander van Wettem, who take care of this gathering from behind the scenes, together with our hosts Nina Spa and Hanna Rustomier. And at last, a few housekeeping notes. In regards to program, following the introduction by Irit Rogoff and Nora Sternfeld, we will have a presentation by Larry Achiampong, followed by a conversation with Irit, and then a presentation by Lynhan, followed by a conversation with Nora. After that, there will be a couple of minutes, 15-minute break in the program, followed by a plenary conversation, and I really hope this could become a lively exchange between us here in the room and those online, who please feel free to post your questions into Q&A function or chat function on the Zoom. These questions will be brought up to our guests. After the program, we hope you join us for drinks with our guests, and please note that the program is live streamed, recorded, and photographed, and the recording will be made available within a week or so time online. And with this, Irit, Nora, I hand this over to you. Thank you.
With Mike? I start with Mike. So first of all, we want to express our gratitude to BAC, to Maria, Julia, and Thomas, and for this wonderful opportunity that we have to reanimate a project that was very long in the making and had to, and whose journey was not clear. We had to clarify many aspects of it as we worked. It was a project made by Nora and myself, and the participants in our programs. Nora was head of Kuma in Helsinki, and I was working in curatorial knowledge in London, and the participants in both of our programs took on the sort of much of the work of actually making these interviews. And the importance of that was not necessarily labor, although that helped, but it was to a very large extent that our participants came from all over the world, and it allowed us a kind of reach into places that we weren't that familiar with, but into very specific local histories that we weren't familiar with. And so it's very much a joint production of our two seminars. And it took forever. It took 2 or 3 years to make because of these kind of long conversations that we were having with the participants in our seminars until the kind of ideas gelled. I want to start off by saying that it's a project that was animated by a kind of profound contradiction. And the contradiction was that on the one hand, I think both of us and many people in our milieu are very excited by exhibitions, right? Exhibitions are a moment in which so many things converge together. They're sort of people's work and concerns and larger issues, but mostly the exploration to find a language, a set of new forms in order to engage with issues that of urgency to all of us. So on the one hand, exhibitions were the source of genuine excitement and a sense of learning and encountering. And on the other hand, they were operating within this kind of capitalized, financialized, neoliberal framework of market forces. And so the result of that was a kind of push-pull. On the one hand, you're excited by some of the things you see, and on the other hand, you are genuinely put off by the framework in which they're operating. And that is a very interesting place to start a project, right? Because it's a kind of internal contradiction that is essentially unresolvable. And I find unresolvable contradictions the best place to start a project. So the question there then became a sort of if we created a kind of non-canonical archive, would we be able to slightly, only slightly, exit the sort of off-putting part of this equation? And I think that's kind of the point of Anecdoted archive. It's based on a piece of work that some of you might know by Daniel Spurri, which is called, I think, An Anecdoted Archive of My Desk. I think that's what it was called. And a colleague of mine, Sarat Maharaj, used to use it as the template for teaching his seminar. He sort of would work with them through Spurri's work, and I thought this is kind of an interesting way of working, and we will borrow this notion. So we set off to make an archive, and it's kind of important to say that this is not archival in the sense of commemoration, right, or being restorative, or insisting on permanence. So very often the kind of made archives, newly initiated archives, come out of that insistence that something needs to be made permanent, something that has been kind of elided needs to be restored, something important needs to be commemorated. And this was in no way kind of animated by that sense. Rather, what we kind of wanted to create was the contours of an encounter. So the sort of encounters, performative encounters, are very slippery. And so we wanted to think about the contours of an encounter, because encounters and performances resist documentation. the sort of, and there's a great body of work by Peggy Phelan, by Rebecca Schneider, that really kind of explore the inability of encounters and performances to be reproduced. But as André Lepecki has argued, they are the foundation of acts of witnessing, which is how pedagogy and induction take place, kind of transcultural and transgenerational transmissions. So if you start from there, if you start not from the perspective of needing to pin something down, needing to make something concrete, if you start from the perspective of acts of witnessing, in which what is brought forward or performed in the encounter and your part in kind of taking it in and being affected by it are of equal importance, then we have the kind of a very different entry point into the sort of acts of archiving, and they become kind of moments of being affected and moments of transmission. The sort of, as you narrate something, you create a moment of transmission. And Lepecki argues very, very persuasively that this is pedagogy. That pedagogy is forms of narration and transmission of encounters across generations, across cultures. Equally, we set out, so that was kind of one very important aspect of it, that it's not about capture, right? It's about kind of trying to see what an ongoing life is that continues to affect and continues to be transmitted. The other sort of impulse into this was we set out to produce a counter-geography of an exhibition landscape. So it's redundant for us here to say that the history of exhibitions is both Eurocentric and market determined. I mean, this is like a truism that we all know and I think I hope accept. And the fact that it's the kind of fundamental Eurocentrism of exhibition landscapes is not just because they sustain particular cultural values and financial and reputational forces, and that these two, the sort of financial, reputational, and sets of values that are sustained by this kind of Eurocentric landscape of exhibitions are not mutually exclusive. They're all imbricated in one another and operate together. But I think all of this is a truism that we don't really need to repeat. Edward Said, in a very wonderful essay that I taught for many years called Geography and Narrative, says that the problem with cartography is that it is a colonial project and that it is the view from nowhere. And so the sort of, that only the colonial project has the sort of kind of transcendent, universalizing capacity to produce mapping, to produce cartography as the view from nowhere. Nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. What we set out to do is to counter the frontality of speaking of exhibitions by shifting the terms of reference. And so it wasn't about, oh, let's look around the world and see places that have somehow escaped the kind of attention that large-scale Western canonical exhibitions get. But it was, if we shift the terms of reference away from that kind of cartography, which is always insistently from the center, what would we discover? And would we discover simply a set of exhibitions, other exhibitions that we hadn't heard about, hadn't been written about, or would we discover, much more importantly, a set of relations that viewers somehow developed with those encounters? And so the question we asked all of the people who were interviewing and the interviews that we did individually, the question we asked was, what kind of transformative effect might an exhibition have had on your consciousness? Which is, you know, if somebody asked you this, you would be quite sort of I think, taken aback. It's a big question, it's a difficult question. But it's a question that does precisely what we wanted it to do, which is shift the terms of reference. So if you ask that question, not what did you see that impressed you, but what has affected you, what has shifted your consciousness, you immediately kind of bring people into another relation with what they saw. And that was kind of what we wanted. So this is where we started. This is how we kind of went about it. And now I'll transfer you to Nora, who will give you her perspective.
I actually think we could now have a first glimpse into the archive. We have chosen an extract, like 2 minutes to start with, from a conversation with Bonaventure Ndikung, and let's have a look at it. So here you see how it works, and I will speak a bit about it in a second. But first, I want you to enter with us into one of these conversations.
Oku's documenter, but I think that's too easy because it had an impact on all of us. An exhibition that, I mean, something quite recent and purposefully I choose that is the photography biennial that just took place in Bamako,
Wait, can
Mali.
we start from the beginning, please?
By I would have liked to talk about Oku's documenter, but I think that's too easy because it had an impact on all of us. An exhibition that, I mean, something quite recent and purposefully I choose that is the photography biennial that just took place in Bamako in Mali. It was curated by BC Silva, called Telling Time. And it's an exhibition that I found extremely interesting because of a generation, a broad generation of photographers, very young, but older ones, those that have passed on, like Ojikere, but the younger ones, especially from the African continent, talking about realities on the continent, especially in Bamako, especially in Mali, that has gone through an extreme crisis. So one could notice that people had a huge urge to narrate their time, you know, to talk about what is happening at the moment, you know. So you had these young people, you know, doing photography on the scripts they found in Timbuktu, you know, that were kind of destroyed, you know, during the war, just in the past 2-3 years, you know. So the rescue processes, you know, taking away those scripts that were made in the 12th century, from the 12th to the 15th century. So an extreme source of knowledge, you know, or you know, saving of knowledge, a bank of knowledge that could have been destroyed in no time. You know, these guys went out to do photography on that. But a lot about, you know, a big part of the show was very much about, you know, being in the shadow. I'm still in the process of trying to understand what they wanted to talk about, but a lot was about reflections and a bit about being in the shadow. Of course, the concept of the museum as it is now
yeah. So you got an impression, and we chose this because you can see how Bonaventure, in why we talked, enters in this and relates also to one canonical exhibition, which is Documenta 11, O Quis Documenta. And then he says, this had an impact on all of us, but this would be too easy. And then he starts to tell about another exhibition that did not have an impact on all of us because we did not know all about it, and enters into it. And we can, just through this conversation, we can see that this is a moment not only of encountering something objective that we can keep in documents, but that this is a moment of solidarity in itself, a moment where this coming together also creates some solidarity, affirmation, relation to what is in the shadow. And this is not something that we can capture just through documents. And in this sense, what we wanted to do is entering in conversations in which these moments can come up, even though, of course, they will remain uncapturable. And this is exactly what we are talking about here also now. And I also have I will just add now some thoughts also in relation to what Irit just said, to then come to the very moment in which we are now, because the project is already now some years ago that we did that, and now it has a new face. It comes to something new. It is public and it remains here forever. We were promised, which is actually important for an archive, I think. An archive that does not even want to remain forever. I don't know why it would call itself an archive. So for me, this project only in this very moment becomes what it always promised to be. And in this sense starts its second life as A, being forever, and B, being open source and open-ended. So this is also not canonical, because with its publicness, we invite everyone, we invite you to join it. And if you are interested to take time to encounter people, to think with people about such moments, we would be happy that you would do these interviews and record them. There is in the sense of open source, there is also one page where we explain just how we did it, and then to send it to us, and then we will discuss them. And mainly we just wanted to grow, but also we want to take the responsibility to tell you that something is open does not mean that anything should go there, but that whatever will go there, we will look at it and discuss it. And in case we think it should not go there, which is not very likely, but then we would discuss with everyone who would send it about why and how. but we deeply trust that such a project actually that is based on these affectivities and solidarities interests people who want to join it and not people who want to disturb it or whatever. But if this would be the case, of course we would not put it online and we would discuss it with the people who would do it. So this is the moment for that. It's a beautiful moment, an important moment, and thanks to Bach, this became possible. So to me, the Anecdoted Archive of Exhibition Lives actually comes to life in a certain way only now. Nevertheless, I have some thoughts that came up in my head when Irit talked, and I want to share them with you, maybe also about the history. Irit talked about the unresolvable contradictions that are an important starting point for our work. And I think this is actually very much an engine of what we do with free thought. It's meeting around unresolvable contradictions without believing that these contradictions have to stay as they are. So we are absolutely not, we don't talk about contradictions as something nice and funny that we could mediate. You know, maybe this is the imagination of an art mediator, that we live in contradictions, maybe they hurt, but we can mediate them. No, we find ourselves looking at these unresolvable contradictions as a starting point to understand actually what makes them contradictions, how to look at them differently, but maybe also not, instead of making them more livable, making them less livable. Yeah. So it's, and I would say it's an unmediating practice in this sense. Now let's look at some unresolvable contradictions in relation to our own project. Is there such a thing as a non-canonical archive? I mean, this is a contradiction in itself. A non-canonical archive cannot exist in whatever way any archive will ever create some kind of canon. And when it is related to people who themselves are in institutions, around institutions, going to institutions, it will somehow relate to canonical procedures and so on. Now, and I also want to talk about another contradictions that many of the people we talked with, at that time when we talked with them, if we would have done a mapping, which, as Irit said, would have been in somehow a practice that relates to the history of colonization, if we would have done a counter mapping, they would have been speaking from marginalized positions, and now they don't anymore. So here you see, you know, not only is it theoretically not possible to make a non-canonical archive, to do it is to be part of canonization processes in a very moment when these canonization processes, if we knew it or not, were going on themselves. And Bonaventure Ndikung, that we just saw, is now appointed to be the new director of the Haus der Kultur in der Welt, which is, I think, wonderful, because it's an amazing person, as you maybe already heard a bit, and this is great. But also we have to know this is not a marginal institution. It's the most important soft power institution within Germany. It's, let's say, the Goethe Institute in the world is the Haus der Kultur in der Welt in Germany. So it's not marginal. What does it mean for us? That we would do such a project and that such a project is embedded in processes of bringing in marginal positions as a soft power strategy in itself. What does it mean for us? And if we look at this, if we take these unresolvable contradictions into account, what do we actually understand by an archive? I mean, we know that the history of archiving, just like the history of mapping, of course, has a deep colonial tradition, a police tradition, and also the tradition of organizing knowledge in all its violent ways. And at the same time, it is a place from which history has been read against the grain, has been related to. And I think the thing is that the common right to relate to history is something that is absolutely something absolutely to fight for. Now, when it becomes now open source and open-ended, I think it becomes such kind of an archive also, such kind of an archive that itself is a material to be read against the grain. So it helps us, because even if we wanted to do it non-canonical or counter-canonical, and we find out that it is actually canonical, even then there might be something in it that would work counter-canonically and non-canonically. Even then we would, even if the ungraspable is super graspable, there will be something ungraspable within it. And I think we will talk about this also in relation to the unarchivable, that even emancipatory and problematic archiving practices bring unarchivable moments with them. Now, one of the questions that, of course, is part of any alternative or counter-canonic practice is the question of how to relate to history differently. Because if we say that that history is a commons and the right to relate to it is something that is worth to fight for, the question is how to relate to them not in this powerful way. And here's another contradiction or something we discussed a lot about that I just want to share with you between Irit and me, and I want to also discuss it maybe today. It's the question of if the non-canonical doesn't exist, does it make more sense to create a counter-canon? Or is it not problematic because every counter-canon is in itself A, defined by the canon, it's a counter-canon, and B, a canon? So would it be better to think about an alternative canon, something that is resistant to be defined by its own counterposition? Or is this actually not a contradiction, and should we do both? We discussed this a lot and we were working on it, and I would love to discuss it more. Very important for me in the very moment in which we are now is to remind us that part of the canonization of marginalized position is that neoliberalism is getting rid of canonization. So while we might critiquing the canon, we see that, for example, one example could be that history departments, you can close them more easily than black history departments. What does that mean? I mean, what does that mean? It means that neoliberalism has absolutely no problem to leave canonization behind. And in this sense, it has always been and is opening the door to the post-factual. The post-factual is actually not only a right-wing strategy, is already part of the emptification process of neoliberal relations to the canon and history. And in this sense, a counter-canonical project for me is also not only against the canon, it's also insisting and persisting with the fact that we have to relate and to fight about history. That history is a history of struggles, and the struggle about history is a right that we should not give up. Yeah, and this is what I want to insist on also in relation to this, and just say this is a proposal that is now going out and also going out to be asked to be used against itself and to grow, of course. So and now comes actually Bonaventure's second moment. I want to just quickly introduce to that. So with Bonaventure in the Kong years ago, we had, for me, extremely important or some, for me, extremely important encounters in which we also discussed about museums. And as a gift in the interview, I think he gave me these thoughts that are for me personally also very important and actually at the base of a book that I later did on the Radical Democratic Museum. So yeah, I now chose this moment of the gift for all of us, and maybe we can play it.
Of course, the concept of the museum as it is now falls in a long line of concepts of, of the universal. Some of those concepts that we've taken and transported to the whole world and think that this is the only understanding of what it is. There's a very beautiful paper by Lewis Gordon where he talks about the problematics of not being able to talk about knowledge in the plural. And I find it extremely beautiful because, say even in the English language, you cannot talk about knowledges. You can only talk about knowledge because it is assumed that there is one knowledge. It is the same assumption we take with us when we think that the concept of the museum should be understood through a particular prism. But then, if the museum is a place where things that societies consider valuable are being kept, reflected upon, exposed, explored, exhibited, then museums do exist everywhere in the world. But then, what is even more important is to transcend, that as space, something understanding of a museum as a place that we inhabit, presented. But then I am the museum, and I think that is the point. To my understanding, the museum is what I bring with me. And I think that is the point. So how I experience those things is not necessarily those things. Of course, those things are important, but what I bring with me, what knowledge systems. But then, so that is the one thing. On the other hand, the museum is also me because what knowledge systems. But then, so that is of the things that are of value to my culture or to my cultures that I have, that have been engraved in my body, and that have been passed on from one generation to the other. And we're not talking about genetics here, not at all. In my body, and that have been passed on from one generation to the other. And we're not talking about genetics here, not at all. We're talking about, cultural traits that have been passed on, And I think that is the museum. That is me carrying these knowledge forms, carrying these knowledge systems into the world through performativity. And performativity doesn't mean me in a museum space doing a performance, but my acting within the world. My reflections within the world, the way I gesticulate, the way I interact, the way I talk, the way, all those things. That is the museum. That is my museum. Of course, the concept of the museum.
Maybe the words for a new beginning of this project now.
So, the way we've planned, sort of this afternoon is because it's the launch of an existing project on the one hand, and we wanted to give some sense of why and how and with whom we had done it. And it's also the beginning of a more recent project, which is Nora and I are, so Freethought, the collective we work with, is in residence at Bach for a period of time, and our kind of overall rubric is the notion of spectral infrastructure, and the kind of the hidden and the unacknowledgeable within systems that are in themselves dedicated to a certain kind of knowability, right? So the sort of the hidden, the unacknowledgeable, and often the irrational within systems that seemingly have the capacity to be known. And within that overall rubric, Nora and I, as a continuation of this project here, have decided to think about the unarchivable. And so we wanted to dedicate this afternoon in part to simply kind of setting up this, because this is something that you're able to access, and to kind of put forward some of the building blocks of what we're hoping to be working on now, which is the unarchivable. Freethought is a collective that exists on talking. We talk endlessly, just endlessly, for years, around and around and around things, and that's how it's a kind of form of circular knitting, kind of things kind of come together. But we don't just talk among ourselves. We're constantly bringing in conversation partners, and the conversations with others operate a little bit like a kaleidoscope, right? So you see the same thing, slightly refracted, slightly changed, slightly kind of diffused in its prisms, and it's a very, very circular sort of process. And it's not really about bringing in people who agree with you or people who are working on similar things. It's a kind of recognition of whose work and whose thinking kind of jolts you into another kind of level of recognition. And so in the spirit of this endless talking and this circularity of bringing in kind of more and more conversation partners, we wanted this afternoon to bring in Larry Achiampong and Lynhan Balatbat-Helbock. Right, I got all those names. And we wanted to ask them to tell a little bit about their projects, but then also to kind of open the conversation to revisit some of our own sort of thinking. So we're going to start with Larry, who is there, swinging from side to side. Hi, Larry, and thank you so much for making the time to join us. And I'll say a few words about Larry. He will then present some of his work, and then he and I will be in conversation. So Larry Achiampong is a multimedia artist based in London, whose work puts forward speculative forms of fictioning, combining issues of class, cross-cultural, and post-digital identities. Larry will show segments from his film trilogy, Relic. These films create parallel histories. And so in that sense, there was a kind of sense of a great affinity between what we were trying to do in Anecdoted Archive, this notion of parallel histories. Not the West and the rest, because that is kind of a paradigm that we've all outgrown, but this and that, with constantly contradictory agendas. And I was kind of looking through the materials he sent me, and one thing kind of leapt out, that in 2016, Britain isolates itself through Brexit, and at precisely the same time in Africa, the African Union passport program points towards open borders on the continent in the near future. And so the sort of, in ways that, what becomes prominent, Brexit becomes prominent because Brexit is essentially affects a particular European, a particular Western sense of itself, And what gets kind of left there at the edges without much discussion. And it is this kind of possibility of not thinking in binary opposites, but thinking multi-layered, parallel histories that that kind of drew me to invite Larry to join us today. And the fact that the languages that he's using, and this is something we haven't talked about, but maybe we'll bring it up in the conversation between us, that there's a tremendous need to invent languages, right? That we can't just bring stuff in. And there's no compensation in bringing stuff in to where it was absent from. But there is important work to be done in creating a language for that which we bring in, so that it can be discussed not in familiar terms, but in other terms. So Larry will present some of his work, and after that we will discuss the co- and parallel existence of kind of contiguous narratives. And start maybe kind of thinking towards the unarchivable, which does not need to be excavated, but is within the archive and haunts it. And that's why, of course, the strategy of fictioning is so important, because of the dimension of being able to haunt. So Larry was unable to travel, and so he's joining us online, and I hand over to you.
Amazing. Thank you very much for the introduction, Irit. And also for the invitation as well. I've been a great fan of your work for years, and to finally to be able to kind of share space to conversate around ideas and to share is very, very special. So yeah, I guess we'll get straight into the presentation of work that I want to talk about, which Irit kindly kind of gave a bit of foundation to the Relic Traveller series, which is a project that is represented through a range of media. There are 5 films that exist within the series currently. The work also exists through the use of prose, through the use of objects, performance, and other elements. And it's of course a project that I've been building over time. So when it was first established in 2017, there were plenty of ideas that I wanted to explore and establish, but I guess for various reasons, probably especially that of not having the kinds of resources needed to simply push this complete flux of ideas, I decided to work in a almost kind of episodic format. So if we can bring up the presentation, Thomas, or maybe I'm not able to see, but I'll just I'll work with what it is that I have. Yeah, awesome. So yeah, I wanted to start off with a quote from one of the films within the series, Relic 1, which is the second film in the series, which takes place directly after Relic 0. We are increasingly erased from the times, minds, hard drives, trash boxes, erased from existence. That many of these things will not change for mine, or many more lifetimes, represents a timeless, mandatory depression. Our lives are political because our bodies are. Okay, if we can move over to the next slide. So that quote from Relic 1, obviously like isolated in its element, to kind of give context, is one of many vocal testimonies, essentially, which are picked up by these relic travelers. And I guess to try to, to give understanding to the ideas around the relic traveler, the use of fiction, and the consideration of actual history or history as we know it now. The project is one that takes on our actual, realities of what we are going through. across the planet. Next slide, please. So, as Irit mentioned earlier on, one of the things that really inspired this project was, for me at the time, the Brexit vote, which then kind of proceeded into the vote of leaving the European Union. Interestingly enough, I was working on a collaborative work, the Finding Fanon series with artist David Blandy. And I remember having a conversation with him about what we felt would happen with regards to the Brexit vote. He felt that we would certainly stay. My opinion, based on my lived experience of living in different regions of the UK, especially London, and then also Essex, both regions which are quite different from one another, I was more than certain that we would leave. I think, particular to my own lived experience as a young Black person, but also, being in a different region to London, which is such a cultural melting pot. Being in a place like Dagenham in Essex, kind of, it was a wake-up call to me at the time of the effects of racism, not simply just structurally or through like work environments or schools or things, but literally physically as you can see it. That's not saying that the racism in its kind of like physicality in a place like London is not physical and people don't get harmed out there. They certainly do, but to give you perhaps like a bit of an understanding, in London, I would most certainly see people of color if I was walking down the street. In Essex, on the other hand, I was one of the only people of color, let alone Black person, that I would see literally for miles, if I were traveling to college at the time. So anyway, with that in mind, I wanted to ask the question, what if? Because I'm quite a big fan of science fiction. I'm very interested in kind of thinking about life in parallel of ways, but by using, as I said, history or life as we know it, but by adding other kind of like elements into that conversation. And I remembered at the time that I was reading about the African Union's passport program that's been in development for years, that hopefully will allow Africans to travel amongst the 54 states with no problem of visa. If we can move to the next slide, please. And so in my mind, there are these two oops, sorry. Am I still here? Yeah. There are these two big events that are taking place. On the one hand, you have borders closing with that of Brexit, and its inspiration toward other, Western nations, or, from Europe all the way through to the United States. Months later, we have Trump's presidency. Things that I do not find to be, mutually exclusive. They're all connected as far as I'm concerned. We don't have time to go through those details. But at the same time, this incredible initiative of the African Union. And so Relic Traveller is by definition set at a point in time in the future in which the global West has come into a point of decline. And at the same point in time, or perhaps a point later, the African Union has come into a point of prosperity, of harmony and independence. And upon the many programs that exist, the Relic Travellers Alliance takes an approach to looking at history in a way that perhaps hasn't been considered by any kind of superpower. And how that works is that the Relic Travellers Alliance send these specially trained people called Relic Travellers around the planet, in places where various aspects of oppression, especially connected to colonial heritages, have taken place. And the understanding is to take vocal testimonies that may have been left at various points in time in the past, stories that simply just haven't been listened, or have been uncovered, waiting to be, you know, unearthed. So that's where Sankofa, if you will see within this current current slide, features within the project. So Sankofa, of course, in connection with my own heritage, my own Ghanaian heritage, is in its own kind of meaning, signifies this understanding of going back in time to retrieve something, going back to retrieve something even that may have been standing or sitting right in front of you, but you perhaps never considered or thought about it. So the approach that the Relic Travelers are taking with regards to the AU is to think about a future that is governed from the ground up, not from the top down. One that considers voices that have, you know, in history as we know it, have been continued to be erased or ignored altogether. Go to the next slide. So with that in mind, I would say that my work, with consideration to the heritage of Sankofa, becomes Sanko time, a term that I coined a few years ago. It was very important for me personally, actually, to create a term that allowed my work to exist without, I guess, thinking about heritages that are just inherently simply just Western or European, kind of driven off through the canon or the gaze of whiteness. And I remember having a conversation actually a couple of days ago about this, specifically about the word Afrofuturism, which, whilst on the one hand, you know, I'm very much in awe of many creatives and designers and artists and so on whose work is kind of like, you know, placed within that canon. For me, it kind of increasingly became an issue because although, you know, an amazing kind of like essay or talk kind of developed by, you know, Mark Derry back in the early 90s, for me, my understanding of a conversation around blackness or the potential of the future or the relationship with technology to be you know, held within the white gaze, it just doesn't work for me. So that's where my own approach of considering my own heritage, or again its connection with this idea to kind of look at fictioning as a way of storytelling, as a way of exploring aspects of trauma, but then healing, felt quite appropriate. If we could go to the next slide. And then the next slide after that. So you've just seen a couple of slides of the Relic 1 film, and then of course with this current slide, and then if we can go to the next one, detailing that of some of the Relic series in installation at a show that I worked on, a solo show at Primary in Nottingham called Divided Nation in 2019, I believe. If we could move on to the next slide. So in front of you now, you have a range of vector designs, which I developed during the process of the creation of the first two Relic films, the Phase 1 series of Relic Traveller that I referred to. Initially, these designs were actually supposed to simply just exist as patch logos upon the Relic Travellers outfits, and I'm not sure if many of you are aware of the actual outfits that the Relic Traveller wears, but they are I guess kind of they're altered MiG pilot costumes that historically speaking have a relationship with the Soviet Union, in that they're of Russian design, kind of like pre or kind of circa Cold War era, which were then reverse engineered by the Chinese. And so I was very interested in this understanding of, okay, well, within the now or recent kind of like memory, the Chinese presence within the African continent allows this possibility for me to utilize this costume and further adapt that. But anyway, further back to the point, next slide. I was invited to think about the potential of creating a flag, which had nothing to do with the Relic Traveller project at the time. I was just working on these patch logos to kind of, you know, work as a kind of like identifying set of symbols for the Relic Travellers themselves. Next slide. And through an opportunity with Somerset House, whom at the time I was doing a residency with, I was asked about creating a flag that would sit on top of, you know, their building. And you know, quite an iconic building. If you know you've had the chance of, you know, walking across the kind of like Westminster kind of like Thames area, I was quite taken aback by this opportunity to create this object because, if I'm honest, my own personal connection with flags have always been violent. You know, whether it's the likes of the Union Jack flag or that of the St. George's flag. Again, calling upon my experience, especially growing up in Essex, these flags, you know, used usually by white folk, and I would never feel like I was part of that kind of like conversation. I remember even, you know, earlier points of like 2000s traveling toward my partner at the time, and you know, frequently bumping into West Ham supporters who would have you know, St. George's flag or what have you. If they won a football match, you know, you're okay, you were let off the hook. And if they didn't win a football match, you didn't want to be on that train, or at least with this tone of skin. So, you know, coming back to this kind of this opportunity, if you will, of considering the creation of a flag, it became actually quite an interesting, I guess, conversation or even challenge, if you will, to think about how my experience might be connected with that of many other people's, and how one might be able to create perhaps, you know, a beacon or a symbol or a set of symbols that connect people across continents and leads itself back to the African continent, and especially thinking about that of Pan-Africanism. Go to the next slide, and then the next two slides after that, slowly, please. So out of that, you know, came this series of these flags and designs, which all symbolically have their own different gestures. It's a series of flags which were kind of, yeah, they started out in 2017 and is somewhat of an ongoing series. And again, connected and centered within the Relic Traveller project itself. If we can continue down the slides. Yep, thank you. And yeah, that brings itself most recently, or 2019, you know, just before the pandemic was you know, making its round, doing the rounds around the planet. The project made its way to Transport for London for a project on Westminster Underground. If we could go forward by 2 slides, please. Where I was invited by Transport for London to consider, you know, working within the structures of an underground tube station that exists, in this case, Westminster. And by considering actual research to look into how one might approach creating an artwork, I was given time to spend with London Underground's archive. I was very selfishly interested in looking at the existence or the presence of people of color, or especially Black people within the London Underground network. If we could slowly go across the next 2 slides. And what I found, which I'm not trying to be funny, but I wasn't surprised by, was the lack of presence of people of color. Of course, for those of you who may, you know, be versed within the history of the London Underground and other public services around the UK, of course, there are plenty of people of color from around the planet who were in fact invited to the UK to do all kinds of jobs, menial jobs that British people at the time would not do. Yet I was in this strange kind of place within this archive of finding hardly any information around that. One of the only things I found, in fact, was a pamphlet that kind of read almost like a Orwellian kind of like a novel, talking directly to people of the Caribbean who would be coming over via the Windrush, about what to expect from different kinds of climates, the different types of food to eat, and how to and how to go about their day, and the differences of their own experience within that of the other West Indies. So, when, coming out of that space of doing that research, it became even more important to me actually to explore ways in which the Pan-African flags for the Relic Travelers Alliance could exist within this space. And I just had a feeling that if it could exist there, that it would most certainly connect with people, especially those that are working on the underground. Next slide, please. And I wasn't proven wrong. There was a great response, especially from not just the Black community, but people, of color who both either worked or didn't work on the underground. Even, white folk as well, just to be able to see this thing that they hadn't seen before. And it was very important to show this kind of thing that hadn't been seen before, because it hasn't been given that space. It's about those voices, as it were, that continue to be pushed to the periphery, which of course centers itself back within the main point of the Relic Traveller project, which is to listen to voices, listen to stories that continue to be obliterated from history. Next slide, please. Another example with the project's existence is through other aspects of popular culture. In this case, we have the Hub Tones video, which Sister Jen Inkaru, amazing artist and director, a friend of mine, invited me to bring in the Pan-African flag for the Relic Travelers Alliance at Ascension into the production of a video shoot for the music video Hub Tones for Kamasi, Washington. And that felt like an amazing proposition for me as a practitioner, because, again, just being honest with you, as much as I do create exhibitions, for me, the possibility of creating an exhibition doesn't sit itself simply within a white cube. Now, I will use a white cube space to explore and express myself, but I find that there are plenty of other avenues, whether that's the use of the internet, the use of sound, vinyl, free downloads, all kinds of things to be able to connect with people. Of course, for me, that has a strong relationship also with class as well. I don't come from a background where I was privileged with being able to, go to certain types of exhibitions. I went to the likes of Tate Gallery very late in the day as a result of those experiences. So this kind of situation felt like an amazing space in order for that to be explored, because knowing that this video would then make its way to the likes of YouTube, there would be plenty of people who are likely not going to go into, your usual gallery space because they feel excluded, or they are actually excluded from. Okay, next 2 slides. So, like I said, there exists 5 films within the Relic Traveller series. I would like to play one of the films within the series, perhaps the most recent one, actually, Reliquary 2. If we could move to the next slide, which utilizes lo-fi animation, but brings that in with live acting or live visuals, real life visuals. And this piece was actually, it was created during, I guess, through the first kind of series of lockdowns that took place in the UK. And at the time, I was separated from my 2 children, whom, are very important to my life. They're very much the center of my life, and they inspire me in the practice. And of course, they even sometimes participate in the work. The imagery that you're seeing, for example, my eldest child, Sinai, is the first Relic Traveller, if you've seen any of the films. And what was really, I guess, interesting for me in creating this work is especially through the actual prose, which exists as a letter that I wrote to my children at the time. And I personally wanted to write a letter to them for years, actually, having been inspired by Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, a kind of, book which Coates wrote for his son to talk about the experiences of being young, Black and American, and aging through various points in time, seeing things like the United States' first Black president in Obama, but still the angst of being a Black person and thus constantly being in danger, whether that's from that of the authorities, the police, or through being viewed as a problem by whiteness. If we could go through the next 5 slides slowly, please. So yeah, that brings me, I guess, to a kind of like close currently for the project. I guess before we play Reliquary 2, one of the things, again, that really fascinated me about the potential for this conversation today was certainly thinking about, things that you can't really archive. And it reminded me of my experience as a kid of like listening to stories that my mother would tell me. My mum loves watching films, and I guess in a way I was inspired by her to make films in the first place. But like other members of my family, she's able to weave stories with aspects of our own kind of traditional heritage. And of course, I grew up with that understanding about the griot and its place within holding stories, but then handing those stories down, and how that interpretation sometimes can be changed, elements can be lost, other elements can be found once again. So yeah, with that, I would say, it's quite amazing to think about this approach to things that cannot be archived, as much as within this example of my practice, that the Relic Travelers Alliance look to unearth information. One of the important things is the fact that there are stories that will never be seen or be allowed to be seen because they are lost, quite literally. So with that, I end with this quote, and we'll play Reliquary 2 very shortly after. There is so much more I want to say. There are many teachings that I hope you learn from my failures. I pray that there will be a future for that. But nobody owns time. Protect your mother. Stand for Black women. None of this is possible without them. Thank you.
You're sitting there. You're sitting there. All by yourself. All by yourself. Feeling so down. Feeling so down. Ah. You think that life has shortchanged you all around. That's right.
I can only write at night time these days, when most things are asleep, on standby, still,
numb, dead. So much of life feels slow lately. It might seem odd, but my body is glad. As I write this letter to you two, you'll are likely laying, dreaming, as youngsters should. And I smile, thinking about all the kinds of possibles and parallels that await yourselves. But I cannot hold those thoughts for long. They keep getting interrupted. My mind is dizzying out, and I'm traumatized at the imminent dangers we face. All of a sudden, so many of the comics or video games I consumed feel ever more prophetic to what is happening now. I was meant to write to you both for a long time, but the world was moving too fast. Growing up in that toxic grip, you race hard or you fall behind with the dust. Countless souls trying to bend against the fierce current without an understanding of the elements, resulting in masses of petrified bodies crushed beneath the wave's momentum. I think that is the problem of living or growing in the old world. To have to try to be strong always. To have to be consistently resilient. To have to be so elastic as to repel all attacks. Born into a machine that will try to turn your lights out at the hint of any resistance to its ways. Yet here, all of a sudden, time as we know it has become formless. And the great Big Ben folds slowly, like marshmallow, melting and flowing into itself. Who'd have thought a disease would have the power to freeze the clock? I wonder how you two will look back at this moment in the future. I don't think it's over by a long shot. The next chapter in this comic is just being written, and nobody's laughing, because they can't see the boogeyman. How do so many governments have capital, stockpiles and contingency for war, but no real plan to protect the people they serve in the event of a pandemic? This disease doesn't care who its victims are. Our government and plenty others continue to put profit over people, convincing us to go to restaurants, while poorer families dealt the worst conditions are left to fend for themselves. If this year were to be thought of symbolically, maybe this disease has exposed truths that have been long buried beneath the carpet. Truths that might not be able to live in the old world we inhabited. I am worried. As if life wasn't hard enough for us before. We make 3% of this island nation's population, but we're 4 more times likely to die from this disease. How can that be anything other than the legacy of racism manifested? How can anybody argue that what is seen on social media day to day aren't snuff films? Why has this terror become a normality delivered by vultures parading as journalists on the high-definition screens we own? And still, justice is not finding its way to black people. I haven't seen you in many months because your mother and I agree that we don't know the true potential of this thing. But I have to help your Nana also. She asks when she will see you again. The authority told us not to worry for children, and yet children have died. They told us not to worry for people with breathing problems in the beginning, and yet those with such issues have died. Our doctors and nurses are getting protected by Blighty with claps. Generations of young people's futures killed by biased algorithms. Meanwhile, our elders are being sold down the river. We've never experienced anything like this beyond the fourth wall. What will you make of all of this that has happened in these last few months, let alone years to come? Are the years to come? I can no longer dive too far forward. The future is a big, blurry grey. But I have to believe that somehow there is a way, or I will descend further into the sunken pit. And so, I think about you too. The furious ocean wraps itself around the Kid Mountain, the dynamic duo. Your names were equally born from coincidences that have marinated beautifully with time. Our pride, our love, our joy stands in the two of you. We carry the honor to share another moment in this life cycle. Ironically as it may seem, learning of my fragility has brought the hope of freedom ever present. Where you and I come from, we know that we're not here forever, at least not in the flesh-based forms we are told to believe in here. Before the planet began to tremble, so many of us lived in a way that we believed we might exist forever. Perhaps the promise that we will return to the red earth in this cycle is too chilling to comprehend. There is so much more I want to say. There are many teachings that I hope you learn from my failures. I pray that there will be a future for that. But nobody owns time. Protect your mother. Stand for black women. None of this is possible without them. I sit here smiling. At the memories of joyous antics and laughter that explodes from your souls as you share gaming sessions upon lava-imagined space-fueled adventures. And my heart bursts with the stars. This is where I can breathe. This is everything. A balm to my aura. I am calm, serenaded. I am ready. We are ready.
You're sitting.
Larry,
Yes.
I sort of did, yeah, okay. So what we'd like to suggest is there's one thing I really want to bring up now, and then because we need a break, and we continue in the conversation after Nora and Lynhan speak, okay? But the one thing I wanted to bring up about this very, very, very affecting film, which is different from the previous ones, is the sort of the way in which science fiction evokes notions of dystopia that in which we kind of find ourselves. And the period of the pandemic, which kind of in a way preempted any possibility of an imagined dystopia, because it was dystopia. And one of the things I was thinking about through this film is the profound incompleteness, but then the impossibility of ever completing, the understanding of inequality. That one of the things that the pandemic made very evident was that the sort of not just conditions that people of color might have been living in that would have made them more vulnerable to to corona, but even more importantly, the complete lack of medical knowledge that the sort of certain populations do not have access to, right? So sort of lack of knowledge about populations and their predisposition, and lack of knowledge by the populations about kind of medical accesses, medical kind of navigating certain kind of so we saw a kind of incredibly high, disproportionately high level of illness among populations of color in Britain. And what it sort of revealed is not simply that particular set of issues, but I remember thinking, I'll never ever be able to make myself aware of the plurality of kind of levels of injustice that exist, and inequality that exist around me. And so I thought maybe just in reference to this particular, no archive is up to this.
Absolutely.
You might want to say something about that?
Yeah, no, certainly. I think, you know, even simply just the conversation around, you know, the lived experience and how those that have privilege in relation to those that lack or do not have, you know, specific privileges, whether that's due to, you know, race, sexuality, gender, and so on. You can't get someone to experience something that you've gone through. You can talk about it, but you know, they can't, because, you know, the privilege that they're born with, but, you know, it gives them a different kind of you know, avenue or what have you. It's something that I speak to David Blandy quite a lot about in our collaborations, and to be honest, that's what our collaborations really focus on. I'm not sure if, I mean, I sometimes I joke about it, but I'm actually serious. Like, I'm not sure we'd really be working together if there wasn't an interest to have conversations around that. Because there is this kind of like almost impossible kind of space of trying to reconcile what can't be reconciled, right? And I think what kind of like intrigued me about, you know, like the lockdowns, or at least from the perspective out here, you know, when the world witnessed, you know, the snuff tape of George Floyd being murdered, and then, you know, following from that, people would post black squares on whether it was, you know, Instagram or whatever, Blackout Tuesday, all of that stuff. You know, for me, there was just really the, and I think I can say, you know, amongst other, you know, black folk that I know and people of color, there's this feeling of course, like anger, but also just like tiredness of having to try to explain your experience and to be told that you're lying, or that you're overreacting, or you're just being moody, or all of these things, of which, validly speaking, of course, you know, why wouldn't one be angry or moody about being treated unfairly, or being treated subhuman, or simply just not believed at all? You know, so there's this aspect of fatigue at a point in time where we're all forced to stay indoors, and then this kind of almost fakery of a kumbaya moment of like, oh well, you know, let's go and read like loads of books on certain black experiences or whatnot. And it's just, you know, for me, like I remember having conversations amongst other peers and someone, and just feeling like, you know, like this, it's like a kind of like festival, but it's not fun, it's not funny, it's not, do you know what I mean? There's, and that's not saying that there aren't people who aren't, you know, trying to do better. There are, and there will be, but there is this with this feeling of fatigue and even lack of trust, especially within, you know, the state that continues to fail us. Definitely there is that impossibility, quite simply because the history that's been created by within, you know, the context of the West, you know, in its design for how many hundreds of years, has said that I'm not human, or that my children aren't human. And that's not been reconciled. You know, I can talk about my children's experience of being in school, and you know, the way that they talk about Christopher Columbus still. You know, it's ridiculous. The fact that me and their mother have to undo that work that's been placed into them to create a complex that is going to, you know, deal with them for the rest of their lives. So yeah, that's quite profound what you brought out there. Thank you for that. And just even, you know, the conversation we had yesterday as well, you know, it's been very interesting to consider or reconsider this project that I've been working on, and some of those connecting threads.
About the sort of poetic, you know, the kind of poetic voice, and thinking about, you know, the sort of the capture that an archive can affect, and that which escapes that capture, and the necessity for a poetic voice that produces an excess of that capture, which I'm sort of thinking about in terms of the unarchivable, you know, that kind of that excess. Thinking about really, no, I won't say it. I was going to say something, but I think not. But thank you very, very much for your presentation. And we are going to take a short break of about 10 minutes. And then we're going to come back to Lynhan and Nora, and then have a conversation amongst all four of us.
Amazing. Looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.